Fly into Muscat and the first thing that stands out isn't a skyline, because there really isn't one. No towering glass skyscrapers competing for the horizon, no record-breaking buildings racing each other into the clouds. Instead, low, white, uniformly styled buildings with traditional Islamic architectural details, government regulation quietly requiring new construction to fit a specific aesthetic rather than let the market decide what the capital should look like. It's a small detail, but it tells you almost everything about how this country has chosen to develop differently from its Gulf neighbors. Most people who've heard of Oman at all tend to mentally file it somewhere between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Vaguely rich, vaguely Gulf, vaguely interchangeable. That's a mistake. Oman has spent the last 5 decades deliberately building a national identity distinct from the rest of the region, and the deeper history underneath that identity stretches back a lot further than most outsiders realize. Start with the map. Oman sits on the southeastern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, with a long coastline running along the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, bordered by the UAE to the northwest, Saudi Arabia to the west, and Yemen to the southwest. Unusually for the region, Oman also holds a small separate exclave, the Musandam Peninsula, jutting out to control one side of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically vital shipping choke points on the planet, through which a massive share of the world's traded oil physically passes. The terrain here is genuinely unusual for the Arabian Peninsula. The rugged Hajar Mountains cut across the north, including Jebel Shams, the highest peak on the entire peninsula. The interior holds vast gravel plains and a slice of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, one of the largest continuous sand deserts on Earth. And in the far south, the Dhofar region transforms completely for a few months each year during the Kharif, a monsoon season that turns the normally arid hills around Salalah a lush, foggy green, a climate phenomenon found almost nowhere else on the Arabian Peninsula, and one that draws domestic tourists from across the Gulf specifically to see it. The population sits at roughly 5.5 million people, with a genuinely young median age in the late 20s, and Muscat, the capital, holds close to a quarter of the country's residents. The question was never really whether Oman is wealthy by regional standards. It's why this particular Gulf nation ended up looking, feeling, and behaving so differently from the rest of the neighborhood. Ethnically, Oman is more layered than most outside visitors expect. Alongside the Arab majority, there are established Baluchi communities with roots in southeastern Iran and Pakistan, and South Asian descended populations whose families have lived in Omani coastal towns for generations, rather than arriving recently as labor migrants. A legacy of the same centuries of Indian Ocean trade, and later, imperial reach into East Africa that shaped so much of Omani history. That layered heritage shows up in cuisine, in surnames, and in the coastal dialects of Arabic spoken in port towns like Sur and Sohar, which still carry traces of the languages and trading partners those towns dealt with for centuries. Now the part almost nobody expects. Long before oil, Oman was one of the great maritime trading powers of the Indian Ocean. Omani sailors and merchants built extensive trade networks stretching across the Arabian Sea to India, East Africa, and beyond, carrying goods, culture, and at various points military and political influence along with them. That maritime tradition reached its peak in the 19th century, when the Omani Sultanate controlled a genuine overseas empire, including Zanzibar, off the coast of East Africa, which functioned for a period as effectively the wealthier, more prominent half of the empire. The Sultan actually relocated his capital to Zanzibar for a stretch in the mid-1800s, a detail that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time, since most people assume Gulf history runs entirely in the opposite direction, toward Africa and Asia coming to the Gulf rather than the other way around. That East African chapter left a permanent, complicated mark on Omani society that persists today. Zanzibar, under Omani rule, became one of the world's major centers of the clove trade, and more darkly, a significant hub in the Indian Ocean slave trade, a history that modern Oman, like many former imperial powers, has only begun engaging with more openly in recent decades. When the Sultanate eventually split in 1856 following a succession dispute, Zanzibar and Muscat became formally separate states, though the demographic and cultural connections between Oman and East Africa never fully disappeared. There are still Omani families today with East African ancestry, and Swahili remains spoken among some communities in Muscat and other coastal towns as a direct legacy of that shared imperial history. Hold on to that timeline, we will get there. Here is a fact that says more about Oman's ancient economy than almost anything else. This land has been a center of the global frankincense trade for well over 3,000 years. The Dhofar region in the south produced some of the finest frankincense resin in the ancient world. Harvested from native trees and traded across the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and as far as Rome and China through both overland caravan routes and Oman's own maritime networks. That trade was valuable enough for long enough that the ancient sites associated with it, including old caravan stops and trading ports scattered across Dhofar, are now collectively recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site under the name Land of Frankincense. One of the clearest physical reminders anywhere in the world of just how central this particular resin once was to ancient global commerce. Portuguese forces occupied stretches of the Omani coast, including Muscat itself, for well over a century starting in the early 1500s, drawn by the same strategic maritime position that made the region valuable to traders in the first place. Control over sea lanes connecting the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean, and from there to European trade with Asia. Omani forces eventually expelled the Portuguese in the mid-17th century, and it was in the aftermath of that victory that Oman began building the naval power that would, within a couple of centuries, turn into its own overseas maritime empire, rather than remaining merely a territory other empires fought over. Religiously, Oman also took a genuinely distinct path from its neighbors. The majority of Omanis follow Ibadi Islam, a branch of the faith that predates the Sunni-Shia split familiar to most outsiders and exists as a significant majority population almost nowhere else on earth outside Oman. Ibadi tradition has historically emphasized a somewhat more consensus-based, less hierarchical approach to religious and political leadership than either Sunni or Shia traditions typically do. And many historians and Omanis themselves point to that religious backdrop as part of the explanation for the country's characteristically moderate, non-confrontational approach to both domestic governance and foreign policy. Yes, this is the part the title promised, and the modern chapter of Oman's story is genuinely dramatic in its own quiet way. In the late 18th century, the Sultanate in Muscat signed friendship treaties with Britain, beginning a relationship that deepened over the following 2 centuries into heavy dependence on British political and military advisors. And yet, unlike so much of the rest of the Gulf and the wider region, Oman never formally became a British colony or protectorate. That distinction matters enormously to Omani national identity even today, a country that walked right up to the edge of colonization, leaned on British support for generations, and still managed to maintain a formal claim to sovereign independence throughout. But here's the pivot, because the full picture matters more than the headline continuity. Well into the 20th century, Oman remained strikingly undeveloped and isolated by choice. Under Sultan Said bin Taimur, who ruled from 1932, the country had almost no paved roads, virtually no modern schools or hospitals, and travel in and out of the country was tightly restricted, with the ruling sultan deliberately keeping Oman closed off from much of the modernization sweeping through the rest of the Gulf. That changed abruptly in 1970, when Said's own son, Qaboos bin Said, overthrew his father in a palace coup, reportedly with quiet British support, and immediately launched one of the most rapid national modernization programs anywhere in the 20th century. Here is where the armchair daydream becomes a spreadsheet, and where Qaboos's 50-year reign genuinely reshaped the country. Within just a few years of taking power, Oman went from a handful of schools and almost no hospitals to a nationwide infrastructure of roads, education, and healthcare, funded by the oil revenue that was, by the 1970s, finally being developed at scale. Qaboos ruled continuously until his death in 2020, making him one of the longest-reigning monarchs in the modern Middle East, and his cousin, Haytham bin Tariq al-Said, was sworn in as Sultan the very same day, ensuring a smooth, notably drama-free transition of power in a region where succession crises have historically been anything but smooth. That transition mattered more than it might sound, because Qaboos famously never publicly designated an heir during his lifetime, leaving instructions in a sealed letter to be opened by the Royal Family Council only after his death. a genuinely unusual succession mechanism that could easily have triggered instability in a country this dependent on a single, unifying ruling figure. Instead, the transfer of power to Haytham happened within hours, without public disruption, reinforcing Oman's broader reputation for quietly managing exactly the kinds of transitions that have destabilized other monarchies in the region. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying the journey, a like and a subscribe genuinely help. Let's talk numbers, because Oman's modern economy only makes sense with real figures attached. GDP sits at roughly $110 billion nominally, with GDP per capita landing around $20,000 nominal and considerably higher, close to $42,000, when adjusted for purchasing power. The economy remains heavily weighted toward oil and gas, together accounting for a large share of government revenue and exports. Though Oman has been pushing a genuine diversification strategy under its Vision 2040 development plan, expanding tourism, logistics, mining, and renewable energy in an effort to reduce that dependence before global oil demand eventually shifts. Unemployment sits low on paper, around 3%, though as with its Gulf neighbors, that figure looks different once you account for how much of the private sector workforce is made up of foreign labor rather than Omani nationals. Logistics and shipping have become one of the more promising pillars of that diversification push. Oman's ports at Salalah and Sohar sit outside the Strait of Hormuz entirely, on the open Arabian Sea coast, giving them a genuine strategic advantage over Gulf ports further inside the strait. Any disruption or bottleneck at Hormuz simply doesn't affect vessels calling at these Omani facilities the same way. A geographic quirk that has made Oman an increasingly attractive alternative transshipment hub as regional shipping companies look to reduce their exposure to potential choke point disruptions. Tourism, too, has been growing as a deliberate pillar of that same diversification strategy, though on a smaller and more tightly managed scale than the mass tourism model pursued by Dubai. Oman has generally favored a higher-end, lower-volume approach. Eco-lodges tucked into the mountains, boutique desert camps, and dive operations along a coastline that includes some of the least disturbed coral reefs in the Gulf region, reflecting the same broader national instinct toward controlled, deliberate growth rather than rapid, unrestrained development. Mining has also emerged as a genuine growth area, with copper deposits in the northern mountains drawing renewed investment as global demand for the metal has climbed alongside the broader energy transition. Here is a fact that says more about a whole country's diplomatic character than almost anything else. Oman has spent decades deliberately cultivating a reputation as the Gulf's neutral broker, maintaining working relationships with Iran even as most of its Gulf neighbors treat Tehran as an adversary, while simultaneously staying close to the United States and Britain, and quietly hosting back-channel talks between rival powers on more than one occasion over the years. That balancing act has generally served Oman well, keeping it largely insulated from the sharper regional rivalries that have drawn in countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It has also, as of 2026, put Oman directly in the crosshairs of exactly the kind of great power friction it usually manages to avoid. Regional tensions tied to Iran have recently pulled Oman into pointed diplomatic pressure from Washington, a genuinely unusual and uncomfortable position for a country whose entire foreign policy brand has been built around staying above exactly this kind of confrontation. No honest account of modern Oman can skip its structural challenges either. The country carries meaningful government debt built up during periods of lower oil prices, and with close to a third of the population under the age of 15, generating enough private sector jobs for the country's fast-growing young workforce remains one of the government's most persistent long-term policy concerns, a challenge shared in different forms across most of the oil-dependent Gulf states, but one Oman faces with a notably smaller financial cushion than wealthier neighbors like Qatar or the UAE. Nature and heritage here run remarkably deep for a country this size. Beyond the land of frankincense sites in Dhofar, Oman holds the Bala Fort, one of the oldest and most architecturally significant fortresses on the Arabian Peninsula, and the Aflaj irrigation systems, an ancient network of channels, some over 1,000 years old, that still actively distribute water across Omani farmland today, using little more than gravity and precise ancient engineering. The archaeological sites at Bat preserve Bronze Age tombs and settlements dating back roughly 5,000 years, among the best preserved sites of their kind anywhere in the region. And Oman's coastline and mountains together support genuine biodiversity rarely associated with the Gulf, including nesting grounds for endangered sea turtles along the Dhofar coast and free-roaming Arabian tar, a mountain goat species found almost nowhere else on Earth. Daily culture here still runs on rhythms distinct from the rest of the Gulf as well. Omani men commonly wear the dishdasha alongside a distinctively embroidered cap called the kuma, rather than the gutra headscarf more associated with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And many still carry the khanjar, a curved ceremonial dagger, on formal occasions, a genuine marker of Omani identity rather than a tourist prop. Frankincense itself remains part of daily domestic life, still commonly burned at the end of meals and social gatherings, a living continuation of the same trade that built the country's ancient economy millennia ago. Now practiced simply as everyday hospitality rather than international commerce. For anyone actually planning to visit Muscat, rewards a slower pace than most Gulf capitals, with the Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque in the old quarter of Mutra, including its centuries-old souk, offering a genuinely different rhythm than the mall-centric tourism of neighboring cities. Nizwa, once the country's historic capital, holds one of the region's most impressive forts, along with a lively traditional livestock and produce market still run largely for locals rather than tourists. The Hajar Mountains offer hiking and canyon exploration on a scale genuinely surprising for the Arabian Peninsula, and a visit to Salalah during the Kharif season, roughly June through September, shows off a green, misty landscape that upends almost every outside assumption about what this part of the world is supposed to look like. Winter months, November through March, remain the most comfortable window for exploring the rest of the country before the harsher summer heat sets in. Wahiba Sands, a stretch of rolling orange dunes a few hours from Muscat, offers overnight desert camping with local Bedouin guides who still maintain camel herding traditions alongside running tourism operations, a genuine blending of old and new economic life rather than a purely staged experience for visitors. And Musandam, that separate northern exclave overlooking the Strait of Hormuz, offers dramatic fjord-like coastal scenery. Dhow cruises through steep, narrow inlets past dolphin pods are a genuine highlight for visitors who make the slightly longer journey up, and a reminder that even within a single mid-sized country, Oman's geography rarely repeats itself from one region to the next. So here is the mirror. Oman built a maritime trading empire that once stretched to East Africa, sat on one of the ancient world's most valuable trade goods for 3,000 years, walked a genuinely rare tightrope between deep British influence and formal independence, transformed from one of the most isolated countries on Earth into a modern state within a single generation under Qaboos, and has spent the decades since building a foreign policy identity based on staying friendly with nearly everyone at once. It's a country that is genuinely ancient in its maritime and trading routes, and genuinely young in its modern infrastructure, genuinely wealthy by regional standards, and genuinely more careful with that wealth than some of its flashier neighbors. Genuinely committed to neutrality, even as the region around it makes that neutrality harder to maintain by the year. Maybe the real question isn't what real life in Oman is like. It's how much longer this country can keep quietly doing things its own way, while the rest of the region keeps getting louder around it. If you learned something here, that's what this channel is for. Like the video, drop a comment with what surprised you most, and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives. There's a lot more of the world worth actually understanding.